Hello and welcome back to our channel on this beautiful day. We are thrilled to have you with us as we dive deep into the latest dramatic twists and emotional turns unfolding in Genoa City. Grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let us explore the profound psychological landscapes of your favorite characters. The landscape of Genoa City has always been fraught with emotional turbulence, but for Sharon Newman, the current atmospheric pressure is undeniably suffocating. She has been forced to navigate an unrelenting storm of trauma, carrying the weight of multiple crises that would easily break a lesser woman. The sheer magnitude of the tragedies surrounding her has created a psychological prison, leaving her desperately gasping for a moment of peace. From the horrifying resurgence of her darkest historical nightmare to the heartbreaking unraveling of her own flesh and blood, Sharon's daily existence has become a masterclass in endurance. Her maternal instincts are constantly on high alert, while her romantic soul is being battered by the agonizing reality of the man she loves spiraling out of control. This relentless barrage of adversity is setting the stage for a profound shift in her trajectory, one that might finally force her to seek solace outside the chaotic gravitational pull of the Newman family. The psychological toll exacted by the entire situation involving Matt Clark cannot be overstated. Matt is not merely a villain in Sharon's story, he is the architect of her most profound historical traumas, a monster whose very name evokes a visceral response of terror and revulsion. The recent revelation of his survival and subsequent amnesia has done little to soothe her frayed nerves. Instead, it has created a paralyzing paradox. Sharon is forced to exist in a reality where her abuser breathes the same air, yet remains blissfully ignorant of the devastation he has caused. This cognitive dissonance keeps Sharon in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, her mind constantly anticipating the moment Matt's memories might return and reignite his reign of terror. The emotional exhaustion of living in this suspended state of dread is draining her reserves, leaving her vulnerable and desperately in need of a protective, stabilizing force that can offer genuine security. Compounding this deep-seated fear is the agonizing heartbreak of her daughter's mental collapse. Mariah Copeland's descent into postpartum psychosis and her subsequent confinement in a psychiatric facility have carved a hollow ache into Sharon's maternal soul. Watching her child, who has already survived the manipulations of cult leaders and the trauma of kidnapping, completely lose her grip on reality is a burden no mother should bear. Sharon is acutely aware of the fragile nature of mental health, given her own historical battles with bipolar disorder, making Mariah's suffering all the more resonant and painful. The agonizing visits to the facility, witnessing Mariah's desperate attempts to cling to a reality that has slipped through her fingers, leave Sharon emotionally depleted. She is pouring every ounce of her remaining strength into being a pillar of support for her daughter, leaving absolutely nothing for herself. Just as Sharon attempts to balance these monumental crises, the universe delivers a devastating blow on May 27th. The creeping, insidious shadow of Nick Newman's severe fentanyl addiction finally culminates in a horrifying crescendo. Inside the confines of Phyllis Summers' office, the chemical demon that has been quietly consuming Nick violently asserts its dominance. The scene is one of absolute terror as Nick, completely overwhelmed by the toxic substances ravaging his system, collapses to the floor in a near-fatal overdose. The sheer suddenness of the event shatters any remaining illusions of control he or his family might have harbored. It is a visceral, terrifying manifestation of the opioid crisis striking at the very heart of the powerful Newman dynasty, proving that no amount of wealth or legacy can shield a person from the merciless grip of addiction. For Sharon, witnessing the father of her children and the enduring love of her life lying motionless, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads, is a trauma that transcends description. The panic that ensues is a chaotic blur of desperate medical interventions and suffocating fear. In that agonizing moment, Sharon is forced to confront the very real possibility of a world without Nick Newman. The man who has been her protector, her partner, and her greatest heartbreak is reduced to a fragile, broken shell, fighting a battle entirely within his own compromised biology. The emotional whiplash of this near-death experience leaves Sharon profoundly shaken, forcing her to realize that the man she has been waiting for is entirely incapable of being a partner to anyone until he saves himself. The catastrophic collapse serves as an explosive wake-up call for the Newman patriarch and matriarch. Victor and Nikki Newman, horrified by the stark reality of their son's mortality, immediately mobilize a formidable united front. The time for gentle suggestions and outpatient leniency has violently expired. Nikki, harboring a deep, agonizing understanding of addiction from her own lifelong battles with alcoholism, recognizes the deceptive, manipulative nature of the disease. She knows that Nick's previous attempts to manage his recovery while remaining entrenched in his daily life were a recipe for disaster. Together with Victor, they orchestrate a rigid and compromising intervention, pushing Nick with the full force of their parental authority to finally take genuine accountability for his devastating dependency. The family consensus becomes painfully clear. Nick must be removed from the toxic environment and the relentless triggers of Genoa City. Outpatient treatment is no longer a viable option for a man who has repeatedly proven incapable of resisting the temptation of the pills. The only path forward is a strict, immersive inpatient rehabilitation program. This transition is framed not as a punishment, but as a desperate, necessary measure to preserve his life. In a residential facility, Nick will be stripped of his enablers, his ability to hide, and his access to the outside world. He must face the grueling, agonizing process of detoxification and the subsequent psychological unearthing of the traumas that led him to self-medicate in the first place. It is a mandatory exile for the sake of his survival, and it requires absolute dedication. This necessary isolation creates a massive, undeniable physical and emotional chasm between Nick and Sharon. For months, the narrative trajectory seemed to be slowly, inevitably pulling the beloved couple back into each other's orbits. The promise of a renewed romance hovered in the air, a beacon of nostalgic hope amidst the surrounding darkness. However, Nick's descent into severe addiction and his subsequent institutionalization have brought that romantic progression to a screeching, definitive halt. The writers are deliberately stalling this highly anticipated reunion, signaling that the timing is fundamentally flawed. A healthy relationship cannot be built on the unstable foundation of active addiction and codependency, and the universe is forcibly keeping them apart to allow for individual healing. With Nick sequestered in a rehabilitation center, battling his internal demons far away from her reach, Sharon is left standing in the wreckage of their shared lives. The constant adrenaline of managing his crises, worrying about his sobriety, and anticipating his next move suddenly dissipates, leaving behind a deafening, hollow silence. This void forces Sharon to confront her own profound exhaustion. She has spent so much time being the caretaker, the worried confidant, and the resilient survivor that she has neglected her own fundamental need to be nurtured. The emotional deficit she is experiencing is staggering, creating a vast, empty space that desperately craves the presence of someone who brings stability rather than chaos. As if responding to this silent plea for equilibrium, the narrative is preparing for the highly anticipated return of Detective James Burrow. Burrow is a man defined by his competence, his unwavering moral compass, and his grounding presence. His impending reappearance on the Genoa City canvas arrives at the exact moment Sharon is most vulnerable and most in need of an anchor. Detective Burrow is not a man of dramatic, destructive impulses. He is a steady, reliable force of justice and protection. His return promises to introduce a completely different dynamic into Sharon's turbulent world, offering a stark contrast to the relentless emotional roller coaster she has been riding with the Newman men. The foundation for a deep connection between Sharon and Detective Burrow has already been meticulously laid. During the harrowing ordeal of Mariah's kidnapping, Burrow proved himself to be exceptionally capable, handling the incredibly sensitive investigation with a blend of professional rigor and profound empathy. He did not merely treat the case as a police matter, he recognized the agonizing human toll it was taking on Sharon. Throughout that terrifying ordeal, Burrow became an unexpected source of immense support, offering Sharon a shoulder to lean on when her world was collapsing. He demonstrated an innate ability to navigate her trauma without exacerbating it, proving that he possesses the emotional intelligence required to truly understand a woman as complex as Sharon Newman. The on-screen interactions between Sharon and James during that dark period crackled with an undeniable, simmering chemistry. Viewers were quick to notice the palpable tension and unspoken understanding that flowed between them. It felt as though they were engaged in a subtle screen test, evaluating the potential for a deeper, more intimate connection. They passed that test with flying colors, establishing a dynamic that is both intellectually stimulating and emotionally resonant. Now that Burrow is returning to a landscape where Sharon is unattached and emotionally adrift, the writers have the perfect opportunity to fully explore this tantalizing romantic potential, transitioning him from a supportive investigator to a genuine love interest. For Sharon, the appeal of a man like James Burrow is deeply rooted in the stark contrast he provides to Nick Newman. While Nick brings passion, history, and an undeniable soulmate connection, he also brings an overwhelming amount of instability, familial baggage, and currently, a life-threatening addiction. Burrow, conversely, represents safety, clarity, and an uncomplicated devotion. As Sharon navigates the emotional fallout of Nick's overdose and Mariah's institutionalization, Burrow can step in as the ultimate emotional sanctuary. He is the kind of man who will listen without judgment, protect without smothering, and offer a steady hand when she feels like she is drowning in the Newman chaos. This slow-burn romance could provide Sharon with the healing and validation she so desperately needs. Looking at Sharon's journey, it is impossible not to feel profound, aching empathy for her relentless struggles. It often feels as though the universe has singled her out to endure an unfair share of tragedy and heartbreak. Watching her constantly sacrifice her own peace of mind to save the broken people around her evokes a genuine sense of sorrow. She is a woman of immense resilience and boundless compassion, yet she is perpetually starved of the simple and complicated love she so freely gives to others. The thought of her finally finding a haven in a man like Detective Burrow brings a genuine sense of relief and hope. She deserves a romance that does not require her to be a savior, a relationship where she is cherished and protected rather than constantly tested by trauma. Seeing her smile genuinely and burdened by impending disaster would be a deeply satisfying reward for a character who has endured so much darkness. However, in the dramatic world of Genoa City, peace is always a fleeting illusion, and every new beginning carries the seeds of future conflict. As Sharon slowly allows herself to open up to the comforting embrace of Detective Burrow, finding a fragile happiness in his steady presence, a ticking clock echoes in the background. Nick Newman is fighting the battle of his life within the walls of his rehabilitation center, driven by the desperate hope of reclaiming his family and the woman he loves. The agonizing question that hangs in the air is what will happen when a newly sober, fiercely determined Nick finally emerges from his isolation, ready to fight for his future, only to discover that Sharon has found her sanctuary in the arms of another man. The impending collision between past soulmates and a stable new love promises a devastating emotional war that will leave no heart unscathed.